There is no good reason why the opinions and proclamations of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, should matter at all to anyone. The organization was founded in the late 1970s, not by a medical doctor, but by a social psychologist named Paul Allen Walker. Walker worked with John Money, who, as you know, if you heard on this show, is the depraved quack who performed sexual experiments on young boys, causing 2 of his test subjects to kill themselves. Walker, for his part, who was openly gay, lived in the Castro district in San Francisco, set up his practice in the same city where he helped facilitate sex change surgeries. It's back like in the 60s and 70s. He also had a treatment center, quote unquote, for sex offenders. But Walker never met someone who wouldn't be diagnosed with gender dysphoria according to him. I mean, he would just diagnose anyone. For example, Walt Heyer, who's a man who detransitioned back in the early 90s and has been speaking out against the gender ideology industry ever since. He tells the story of his initial consultations with Walker in 1981. Now, Heyer was abused by his grandmother as a very young boy. If you've heard his story before, you're familiar with it. But he was, just to summarize very briefly, he was forced to dress in girl clothing as like a 4-year-old child by his grandmother. And to use the current phrase, in other words, he was sort of socially transitioned into a girl against his will, just because his grandmother was an abusive psychopath. Now, in his 40s, Heyer became a patient of Walker and explained this history of childhood abuse and trauma to him. But he was immediately diagnosed with gender dysphoria anyway and recommended for hormones and surgery. So to be clear, Walker's recommendation was that Heyer should use drugs and surgery to affirm the false identity that his insane, abusive grandmother created for him when he was 4 years old. That's the kind of mental health professional that Walker, the founder of WPATH, was. Eventually, he died of AIDS, and the leadership of WPATH was passed on to somebody else, which brings us to today. Today, the president of the organization is a man named Walter Pierre Bowman, who is a sexologist and quote-unquote trans health specialist. He's on his way out, though, apparently, and the president-elect of the organization is Marcy Bowers, who's the trans sex change surgeon featured in my film, What is a Woman? The organization's treasurer is a guy named Lauren Schechter, who's a plastic surgeon from Chicago and who also performs gender transitions on adults and children. In fact, all the way down the line, from president on down, in this organization, you find people who are not only totally ideologically invested in the trans agenda and therefore untrustworthy sources of information, but even worse, they are financially invested. Bowers, Schechter, many of the rest in leadership and on the board all have made millions of dollars from the gender affirmation business. So now they're in charge of WPATH, and the more that WPATH relaxes their recommendations and guidelines and sort of opens things up, and the more of the population that they can include as potential patients and as potential candidates for gender affirmation procedures, quote unquote, the more money they personally make. This is a conflict of interest, to say the least. And yet it has not stopped WPATH from becoming the leading authority on trans health in the world. Not according to me anyway, but according to all the major medical institutions and organizations. It shouldn't matter what they say or what they recommend, but it does. Because whatever they declare is uncritically adopted by every other major medical organization in the Western world, which is what makes their highly anticipated set of new guidelines just released this week, unfortunately, relevant. Christina Buttons, who's our new and quite fearless reporter at the Daily Wire, reports this. Quote, the leading Transgender Health Association has released its much anticipated new guidelines. One aspect noticeably different from previous editions is that the explicitly stated minimal age recommendations for minors to obtain puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries have been removed. Now, to state the obvious here, or to restate, that means that there is now no official minimum age recommendation for any gender transition procedure. So continuing. The new guidance also suggests that if parents do not affirm their child's newly chosen identity, the state may be enabled to intervene in order to assist with the child's transition. WPATH published its Standards of Care 8th edition in the International Journal of Transgender Health on September 6, 2022. A correction was published in the same journal on September 15th, which removed sections pertaining to, quote, minimal ages for gender-affirming medical and surgical treatments for adolescents. A confidential draft of the 8th edition was released for public review in December 2021 that lowered the recommended minimum age for minors to obtain cross-sex hormones, which cause permanent changes to the body, from 16 to 14. And then also irreversible chest, face, and genital surgeries to 15, 16, and 17, respectively. Little has changed from the early draft, and while WPATH no longer provides explicit minimum age recommendations in their latest official guidelines, a close reading of the text finds that age suggestions are woven into the text. So, before we read a little bit more of this, there are basically two ways to potentially interpret WPATH's decision to remove the explicit minimum age recommendations from the text. One is that they don't want there to be any minimum age. They want to open the door for any procedure at any age. We heard from a gender surgeon in a clip last week that he doesn't recognize any minimum age at all for any form of medical intervention. We heard that explicitly. Or you might theorize that WPATH removed some of these minimum age guidelines, or at least made them harder to find in the text, made them a little bit less clear, because they don't want people to know that these things are being done to kids as young as 14. I mean, they've been talking openly about doing these things to kids for many years, but now some of us are paying attention and drawing attention to it, and they don't want that. Which is the same reason why children's hospitals and other clinics around the country have been frantically removing this information from their website. Any mention of performing any sort of procedures on kids, they're removing from the website, not because they don't do it anymore, but because they don't want us to notice it. They don't want to give us something really simple that we can point to and say, oh, you see? They're trying to make it harder for critics to expose what's going on, rather than laying it all out plainly in a document that we can, again, just point to and say, well, there it is. Now, I tend to think that out of these two possible explanations, maybe there's truth to both. Reading on. Chapter 6 on adolescence in the new guidelines suggests that cross-sex hormones may be administered to children as young as 14. Quoting from the document, it says, more recent guidelines suggest there may be compelling reasons to initiate gender-affirming hormone therapy prior to the age of 16, although there are limited studies on youth who have initiated hormones prior to 14 years of age. In the same chapter, so you see how they have the ages there. They make it a little bit more obscure what they're actually saying, a little bit more. In the same chapter, guidance is issued for chest masculinization surgery, otherwise known as a double mastectomy, which is the removal of healthy breasts. Quoting again from the document, it says, chest masculinization surgery can be considered in minors when clinically and developmentally appropriate, as determined by a multidisciplinary team experienced in adolescent and gender development. Though no precise age is indicated, most pediatric gender clinics will perform double mastectomy surgeries on 15-year-olds. Guidance on vaginoplasties, the creation of a pseudo-vagina using existing genital tissue, indicates that they may be obtained as a minor as well. Quoting again from the document, while the sample sizes are small, these studies suggest there may be a benefit for some adolescents to having these procedures performed before the age of 18, reads the guidelines. Now, keep in mind again that younger children undergoing gender transition means millions of more dollars in the pockets of the very people who are making these recommendations. Now, we should know that WPATH does at least have one form of genital mutilation which it does not yet recommend for kids. Quote, the only genital surgery it seems the WPATH is comfortable setting an age recommendation for is phalloplasty, which creates a penis-like phallus from skin grafts taken elsewhere in the body. The document says, given the complexity of phalloplasty and current high rates of complications in comparison to other gender-affirming surgical treatments, it is not recommended that this surgery be considered in youth under 18 at this time. The at this time qualifier is rather glaring and conspicuous, and so is this part. Reading from the document. We recommend when gender-affirming medical or surgical treatments are indicated for adolescents, healthcare professionals working with transgender and gender-diverse adolescents involve parents or guardians in the assessment and treatment process, unless their involvement is determined to be harmful to the adolescent or not feasible. Helping youth and parents/caregivers work together on important gender care decisions is a primary goal. However, in some cases, parents and caregivers maybe too rejecting of their adolescent child and their child's gender needs to be part of the clinical evaluation process. In these situations, youth may require the engagement of larger systems of advocacy and support to move forward with the necessary support and care. Now, this statement from WPATH will be and has been reported as WPATH recommending parental consent. Oh, they're being responsible. They're saying that there should be parental consent. But they're actually doing the opposite, which is quite obvious when you read it. What they're saying is that parental consent matters if the parent says yes. If the parent says no, their opinion doesn't matter. So you only get consent if there is consent. Consent only matters if you say yes. Which is to say that your consent doesn't matter. Your opinion doesn't matter at all in either case. The medical establishment is saying to the parents here, we're going to do what we want to your kids, and we'll get the state involved if we have to. And you can give us your approval and we'll do it, or you can disapprove and we'll still do it. What this means is that the approval is irrelevant and symbolic at best. The parents are cut out of the equation, and consent is deferred not to the child, who cannot actually consent, but to the very surgeons and doctors who are financially invested in transitioning as many people as they can, as young as they can, and as fast as they can. That's what so much of this is about. Now, we know that they are rabid ideologues that are in the gender transition industry, and they're at WPATH, and they're, as I said, ideologically invested in this. They're religious fanatics, and they want to induct as many people as they can into their cult, and that's what's driving a lot of it. But we can't overlook the fact that they're also just scam artists trying to make a buck or $2 billion. That's what much of this traces back to. Hey, I know you're craving some more Matt Walsh Show content. Well, I have some great news for you. If you head over to dailywire.com and subscribe now, you can watch or listen to my full show. You can also listen to my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'll see you there.